All right, we can get started, and I'll keep my eye on the room. Again, apologies to anyone who had to find the alternate link. There's something going on with Wix and Zoom. I have my website is through Wix, and it says you can attach or connect through Zoom. Last time I tried the link to see if it worked, and I thought that's what destroyed the link, so I didn't touch it this time. And then I came on early to just see, and I said I'll just stay on early, and it was kaput. So I don't know. I've tried to research this issue. We'll have to figure something out. I've got one more reading in the fall. But welcome everyone to a Common Sense reading series. Welcome to this afternoon's readers, Ian U. Lockaby and Emily Stoddard. For anyone attending for the first time, I'm Jordan Stempelman. If you could mute your microphones, if someone is unmuted here, just mute your microphones. I think I can mute my own. Okay. But anyway, I'm Jordan Stempelman. I started this series in Kansas City, Missouri in 2011. And I have archived the past remote readings on my website. So here is the link to that if you're interested. They're up there. In the next couple of days, this reading will also appear archived on the site. It's through YouTube, so you can check those out. There'll be one final remote reading, and this will take place on Saturday, April 27th, featuring the poets Hilary Plum, Anthony Robinson, and Michelle Turansky. So that will be Saturday, 3 p.m., April 27th. I had to move it. If you saw any type of notice earlier, it was on a Sunday, but had to move it to Saturday, April 27th. Before I introduce this afternoon's readers, know there'll be a brief Q&A following the reading. So you can post any questions you may have for today's readers in the chat. I'll answer these on your behalf. Also, writers, if you have any questions for one another, that's enthusiastically welcomed as well. Okay, so let's get started. Ian U. Lockaby is the author of Defensible Space, If a Crow, which is forthcoming from Omnidon in October of this year, and A Seam of Electricity, which is also forthcoming from Ghost Proposal. His poetry has recently been or will be soon published in Fence, Bennington Review, Ecotone, Poetry Northwest, Volt, MQR Mixtape, and elsewhere. His translations of Latin American poets have been published in journals such as the Black Warrior Review, Circumference, Denver Quarterly, as well as chapbooks from Cardboard House Press and Carrion Bloom Books. He founded and edits the wonderful online journal Mercury Furs, and with poet Fahima, is it Ife?
Yeah, Ife, Fahima Ife.
Okay, Fahima Ife. They co-edit the forthcoming journal Press, Lucius. He lives in New Orleans. And before Anthony jumps on here, I'm going to put some links to each of the poets' works in the chat so you can go deeper into their what they're up to these days. So please welcome Ian U. Lockaby.
Thank you so much, Jordan. So glad to be here. I really appreciate the invite, and yeah, really excited to see Emily read as well. So thank you all, and thank you everyone who's tuning in. I really appreciate your presence here on this beautiful Saturday. I'm going to be reading from my forthcoming book, Defensible Space, If a Crow, which Jordan said coming out in October. And I'm just going to read it through from the beginning, jumping around just a little bit, but more or less reading the bulk of it. So yeah, thanks again. I'll set up my timer. Defensible Space, If a Crow. If a crow, then a black ice cube pressed against the grain of the sun. While the afternoon mugs drop pattering spoils of a milked black coffin, the overgrown carpets lay a caffeinated belly, bitter against the sleep, against the dam bright slipping away. If a crow remembers you, By what? Something growly in the vanilla leaf. Don't dawdle now, it's plenty late. A way to tell. You're learning a lot of sad, useful things upon the leaves of this awful summer. This book is great, how it can make you hear different, layers of it amplified in the stacked noise of the striated river. At different times, you've grown and used different times. You've learned to keep time with each of them, stacked and riveted to your rib cage now. And every time you stand, I try to stay still, to be located inside of the ways that I hear. At the upper edges of the sages there become something less sage than a turbid herbal air. Under our hands on the tablecloth, the mountain is running towards the city. In the air above it is little attention to these maps. Cirque, medial moraines, andesite, the cold lavas. Defensible space one. Maybe I will detox like the forest. Maybe I will detox like the dead. Even breathing that smoke now, how will it ever rid me of itself? The smoke off the crow, the smoke off the crow that tells of the fire in the forest, the burning lug, the charred birds were breathed from, the must of broiled fur resins trapped in the embering feather down of their young. At Trillium Lake, there is nausea on the shelves of A's grandmother, the eve of it, a traveler who hasn't been here since she was bedded down in asylum for softening in the violet inconsistencies of mind, but who once set out from here. Mornings she'd take on mountaintops alone, at night tender away whichever worn page. Between five tongues, she moored a distant hunger to. Now cold quail climb windows inside the coldest room in the house where most of the old machines made up for making fire. We sleep aloft the threat of three of them, any more sweat through every night, wanting and wanting, but too hemmed in by cold fever damp to every side of us. The trees darken, raindrop drag through sappy fur filters by gravity waiting round the roots. A picnic basket full of the names you've had for the herbs in your food. Bad, good, uncontrollably laughing with a mouthful. A blackberry vine growing up through the wicker bottom of everything. Songbirds mysteriously dying. Inside of this life is another life I cannot claim. The cicadas' hum distracts the intelligence of dogs. Cicadas hum and mysteriously kill songbirds. A panic takes in the internet. Birding groups arguing over whether to offer the birds water. Throw it in the trees instead, they say. Outside of one's reason is another life. A lupin mash boiled in the high sun for spirit to pour over the rose, seeds risen to the rim of the semi-annual triggering burr owing facial ticks, triggering in the deer tracks, burrs, too deep skin cells pruned off, trails away, ticking hips lit and arms aflame. If a crow, a manic feather copulated with. When the weather turns black fetters, cherry juice seeping from the living ground, under the weight of every step away through autumn. Once a whale ate a crow. It was the meeting of the loud dark sky in the quiet, many cathedrals of the sea. The whale belly is my belly, is our belly, is the quiet cathedrals full of belly silks. I taste a sulking crow in the season. I devour many mediocre specimens of us, myself. Summer where we deemed the strawberries unsaleable, asked the butcher what bones hold the paper up. What bones in the red paper bones stack a pair of pears, and again then to make a pair of pears, and so on, just like us, all in our houses, paired up. But how do people hold up? All those paper bones, all summer was crows overhead, language breaking apart in my hands. The hips rose up the river chutes, shuttling in new terrains, grange, so quick, were semi-rooted, bitterly bird, a burr chap, melody chant, a tick's bad dream, to quit the smoke, a chalice of rose seeds for breakfast, panting over it. Forecast. Not to be what one has been, but that I can only have been what I was, and so on. A banana in your fist in a climate of catastrophe, seance of coffee sap and stone. The air is cold here, even in summertime. And it was summertime, it was cold. It's snowing ash. The best thing to have happened to my lifestyle is my lifestyle, which practically ate the moth as it landed on this page. Are there plenty of places for you to rest in the sun, moth? You choose me. You are the second best thing to have happened to my life. You choose me again and again. A crow grows a quivering tumor of feathers. It acts as a quiver of feathers, not for being bold, though, but admired. Suddenly it breaks a beak and wings its way. The sun is smaller than the kidney stone of a fig. The low black wings of a low sky machine. A low sky, a machinery of mood, of black wings moving in a frenzy of black fish, in a low prey, is a low prey, is magnificent and moody the only way towards prey. The fish of frenzy so magnificent and moody like a machinery of black wings, a low sky machine. If the magnificence is fish, then the machinery a mood, therefore a black wings its way across your temperature. If a crow, it's ambergris. One. I wanted to make one rhyme with you. Lambent grays under the toilet skies, you. So long I am here to terrify myself with my tininess. If it wasn't any trouble, it was all another drink. And if the rhyme wouldn't want with you, it'll take itself back. Two. I'm summering in the bathroom stall, memorizing sanitation law, tide tables of the toilet seas. I'm little enough to see fair, but when I try to flush the big apparent crow that I might ride its weight downward and out towards autumn, the quiet cathedrals, the body of the bird won't fit. And the tides come back that night, whale waked, a harvest wake. Could it take itself back as the waking wants with you? 3. Days later, the two bodies, crow and whale, stink together in a flesh bog unison never replicated. To think of the possible pairs of flesh, feather, fiber never yet found duetting rot. What could it do to our senses to enjoy them? Or the perfume possibilities in the bile duct of the crow? 4. In the terrible season, fledgling crows bounty dead upon the lawns, land fallen ambergris struck low with tinnitus down before first flight. Now for our prophet. If I tried to make this rhyme, it would say, of all the crows buried at sea, whatever happened to your plastic dolly, your marionette nose, the garbage pails in which you collected your plastics, marked with that occult triangle made you to believe in the myth, that whatever went in would be churned back in to our tide of things, our tide of things, our tide of things, our tide of things, but they dumped it in the sea. A miss. In the middle of the street is everyone you know. You stand on the sidewalk missing them. They begin to spread out around a neighborhood looking for the cat that you lost as a child. You don't remember its name, but they all seem to, all calling out, Rain, Rain, don't go away. You're a cat, and I miss you, and you're gone. In the middle of the street is the cat you lost as a child. You used to miss him, but you don't anymore. It begins to rain, but the cat doesn't move. He just stares at you, wide-eyed as rain washes the morning dew from the back of his ears. You think of who you were the day you lost that cat. You can remember how your ears felt, all burning in blood, but you cannot remember the feeling behind your heart that day anymore. You speak to it. You're a cat, and I miss you, and you're gone. My heart stands now in the middle of the street. It's starting to rain again. Behind its ears, the morning dew. Sometimes it is so lonely being with what you thought you'd forgotten. I hear everyone I know hollering in the distance. My heart jumps up and walks away. I never had a cat as a child. Defensible space, too. Maybe I will detox in the forest. Maybe I will detox when I'm dead. Even this carcinogen huff, fogging the summer sun, going mean jeans in the farm's hands, an offering of ipecac against the tomato harvest, as if that old root solution might wrench the ash cough out of, the smoke through which the crow flies descended into and all about me, everywhere a burning root system, everywhere a root fire growing off the splayed tail feathers of a crow. Cispus under the tansy swales. I wanted you to find me like a cat-littered can with a 22 eye. In the mineral hazes, cowlets up the fireweed fuse, slung up towards an untenable skyline. In the breaches of our settlement, end camps at the highest reach of the catastrophe, where you can't breathe for the thin bearings one's allowed on themselves. Head off kilter for collision with the fine fuse line of horizon, a weedy fuse line of horizon sizzling in the mineral hazes of larger fires to the east. A tea, weedy teases wet us down, salving some soaked limbs, anticipate some of the hour a morass in how to find homes in the logic of arson, a nurse tree, mega, old lass, a lemming. I left because I needed to arrive. Always trying to arrive is one way to seldom do, an ever-arriving coincident with the failure to recognize it, the air of our heads conditioned to miss the particles we land on, over and over this progress. I left summer because fall was one way to fall away. It got cold, surfaces came unstuck. Carrying tobacco flowers in a glass jar grown from seed I'd been saving for years. I would smoke the flowers, I would save a few seeds, willing particles to land on. I might then carry one cigarette from the garden up the pass. An empty packet of regulator extracts, high THC, high deltas, at the gravel pull-off over the runoff chute to the mountain spring ditch where we swim naked in the plastic water bottle company's water. They want to eat all the water, they said. There will be nothing left but thirst, and that's fine. Fibers explode in the glass. The windshield meets the wee, dense wind. Ghost bent down over a down log. Shiny bum glowing bristly in the sun, in the sum of the tasty ditch, the tansy crotch. Oh, how the extracts hit. Oh, how. Some of this is unbearably what is. A year ago anymore. A balsam root pointing down the palm of the hour hand. Seconds of 1 year. In the palm of the other, a fist still held in a fist behind its own back. Refusal. I consented to stone after stone in the terrible season till it made a riverbank, and the riverbank made a sleeping form upon which all the rose hips were passed. And now you are sleeping drunk on a bed of them, pressing them to dry anyway, that the forest fire behaves like liquid down slopes above you is what's been made. The windowsill is hollowing itself, stiff little mounds of sawdust coming up through the white paint. Tunnel flex spills through the sill, and I'm wondering how long I can watch the termites' progress before I'm obligated to tell the landlord. Can the window be falling out loose in its socket? Can the inside know the outside? Can I hang the lords loose in the land's socket? My only true obligation is threats to the landlord. To map the roots through the windowsill before they give way to the will of the structure, swallowed to the belly of it. The concept of the structure is hungry for the cross grains, for all that opposes it. To name the termite settlement in my own windowsill fairly. What to call their settlement before a nuisance, an infestation trickling down into the economy of a landlord's headache. That which is to be eradicated in the interest of the structure. What to name the termite town before a threat to the structure, so that it may survive as a threat to the structure. If a crow in dialogues with a whale, how do you speak with a word in your mouth? Liken its having a word with you as you chew your molars with its teats. You are gorgeous with questions. What flavor in the silks? I wash the flavor in the silks. If a crow, then a smother-colored saint, iridescing like a tire fire with one eye on the traffic light, one eye on a piece of tasty trash, being the crux, waiting on the light like a crow might know, in the ruined rhyme of us is the crux, is. If a crow, then an ice cube constructed of black ice, then the mild or immense accomplishments of the radish bone, depending on whether you look. The black ice is growing like tubers underground, sneaking up to the surface every morning to eat the sunlight, to iridesce. And if out one luxated window, one then looks to see at the side of the road a crow tangling with a text, so as to true the obligation, you must follow through with what you've begun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was wonderful. It was wonderful. You had a cold quail in your poem. I have a cold quail in one of my poems too. I don't know how that happened.
I love that.
Yeah. Cold quail turns down heat bit by bit or something. Anyway, that was great. That was wonderful. Um,
Awesome.
all right, so our second reader, our final reader today is Emily Stoddard. Uh, Emily is a poet and a nonfiction writer in Michigan. Her debut book of poetry, Divination with a Human Heart Attached, was released in February 2023. Her poems and essays have appeared or are forthcoming in Tupelo Quarterly, the Baltimore Review, Ruminate, Belt Magazine, Nimrod International Journal, which is such a great name, and elsewhere. In 2021, Stoddard received the Developmental Editing Fellowship in Creative Nonfiction from the Kenyon Review. She's at work on a book-length nonfiction project, parts of which were a finalist for the 2022 Iowa Review Award. I'm going to put again some links in here and a really cool resource that Emily has about called Poetry Bulletin as well. So you can check that out. And again, without further ado, please welcome Emily Stoddard.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for that. There were so many lines that I was writing down over here, but to be located inside of the ways that I hear, oh, I love that. And there's so much sound work in those poems. So it was cool. I was already falling into the sounds, and then to have that line show up to sort of affirm that was just awesome. So thank you. And thank you, Jordan, for the invitation to be here. I actually wanted to start today by sharing a poem from a Palestinian writer. I feel like it's so important to be bringing Palestinian voices in wherever we can right now. And this is Noor Hindi's book, Dear God, Dear Bones, Dear Yellow. She also happens to be a fellow Michigan poet. So, and today is Palestinian Land Day. So I felt like this particular poem from her collection might be a good one to share. And it's called A Home. The breakfast table is my family's connection to Palestine, to home, to Jordan. Eating is sacred, dipping pita bread into olive oil, an act of love. Saturday mornings, you'll find pita bread atop the stove, my mother's hands flipping each loaf above the flames, her warmth filling us. The homeland is stuck in our teeth. It's filling our cavities. It rests on our tongues. My God, how we yearn for its olive trees, how it haunts our dreams, and that's Noor Hindi's poem from her book. This is kind of perfect that I'm paired with Ian because you have crows and I have magpies. So we're in the Corvid family today. My book is Divination with a Human Heart Attached, and there are some persona poems in it. That's what I'm going to be sharing today, is some sequence of persona poems that are in sometimes the voice of the magpie and sometimes the voice of Petronilla, who is like the apocryphal daughter of Saint Peter. She doesn't show up in the usual gospels. She's like in the secret Gnostic gospels that didn't get included in the main event, which is always fascinating to me, who gets left out or not. So there's some persona poems with her and the magpie. I'm going to start with one called The Daughter Infinity. And the magpie is really interesting because there's a lot of mythology around the magpie refusing shelter in the ark, the magpie refusing to grieve the death of Jesus, sort of being like this trickster archetype. So that's kind of where it starts with this book and this poem. This is called The Daughter Infinity. In the beginning, the sea. In the end, the sea. The only story told in many ways. The only story tipped back and forth, old and oracle. The generations ask for equilibrium, safe harbor. None are ready to leave behind what's in their hands. That's what I see. The drowning world, full hands. I do not have wing enough to save anyone. I am mostly syrinx and seeing. I am the shortest path. It has taken many floods to learn this, many more to be comfortable with it. The daughter knew before I did, her shadow the longest. Her father could not speak to her, knowing only the language of before and after. She whispered to me about always and again. There are things coming that are the same thing, she said, and she took a feather from each of my wings and dropped them into the dark. So one of the apocryphal stories about Peter and his daughter Petronilla is that she was a threat for some reason, and he thought the way to kind of manage that was to pray for her paralysis on one side so that she would be sidelined by that. And so part of what the book wonders about is, why is that? What was going on there? What does it say that supposedly the first father of tradition, like this is his prayer for his daughter? So this is in Petronilla's voice. It's called "I Was Running to Him." In those days, God spoke plain, spoke in fish and flour, ran to us with heavy baskets, so we could not miss him, so we would not confuse him with lesser forms of love. At the moment my spine went cold, I was running to my father. The last thing I felt was my long hair, the braid that had come undone. What did he hear when I collapsed at his feet? Heavy body, broken lion, answered prayer. His eyes did not say. They avoided me after that, as though he heard nothing at all. All right, so this poem is called Descendants. Restless for the language an ancestor spoke into the sky of their God, we sift remnants of tongues, break the breath. We count in generations, and this is false math. The ladder of my spine is lined by shores that were not ours to fish, by altars where we bowed and altars we burned, by prayers kept and killed. And we are not done yet, inventing names for what will save us. Even now, some speak of doves and some speak of towers. This next one is called My Father Saw Me Once. It's another in the Petronilla series, and there's a little epigraph with it from the Acts of Peter. Peter said to his daughter, "Now go back to your place, lie down, and become an invalid again, for this is better for both of us." And this is My Father Saw Me Once. In those days, the men spoke in miracles, illusioned us with talking dogs and resurrected fish. I was a miracle once. The arm that slept elsewhere came home to me, the dead corner of my mouth unstoned. But I did not rise, did not speak to the crowd that gathered, knowing by then my silence was itself a life. My father grew angry, seeing that his power to take and his power to give could not alter the daughter inside of me. And so he undid the miracle, which was what the crowd called it. So throughout the book, there's the nursery rhyme that involves the magpie, like one for sorrow, two for joy. And there's a few poems. There's poems kind of lined up with that through the book. And this one's 7 for a secret, which is part of that nursery rhyme. So 7 for a secret. What must have been left in his stomach? Fish, his mother's bread, wild mint, almonds, water, wine, and a single olive pit, which I watched him swallow, remembering what he had told me about how to know when he returned. So I'm going to close with the last poem of the book actually today. And this one is called Here Amen is Not Amen. Home is wherever we hold our breath the least. The white oak does not remember it differently, and her memory is the only God I understand. Here, amen is not amen, but the exhale through the center of moon. Say you know this too, and we can be homesick together. Trade our histories like the trees do, starting at the roots. These secret understories we keep, vast as oceans, but bordered by skin. Let us defy it all, and finding each other, become a revolution. After all, the only real love is the kind that witnesses. The way a full moon shreds the forest open without crushing the ferns, a light that breathes and breathes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was gorgeous.
Thank
Home
you.
is wherever we hold our breath the least. That was wonderful. I'm going to add um, Ian, there we go, to the spotlight. And like I said, I know I have some questions, some things that I want to ask you all about. But I'll wait a second to see if people from the audience have any questions for you all um, about anything that's going on or that they saw in your work, anything that they're interested in asking you about. Um, so maybe while people are thinking about questions, I'm going to ask you something when it comes to persona. Um, because there was something there that I thought that you both, I wrote parable next to your work, Ian. Um, and persona, of course, you announced that, um, Emily, on your own. And I'm just wondering, the idea of, when you're embodying these creatures, when you're kind of passing through them, what are you leaving, and maybe what are you leaving passed over as well when you're kind of going into these states? Like, did you write a lot more through, or did you stay in the mind of these creatures as you were writing? Did you feel like that you were embodying them, in your waking life as well? So those are some questions I have about how you write in kind of the persona, especially when you're bringing in, these non-human elements.
I feel like I got stalked by the magpie, so I don't think I had a choice. It came in dreams, and then when I wasn't listening to the dreams, it showed up. I mean, there's some lines in the book. Sometimes I want to say like, you know, uh, there's so many things in here that aren't just like I can't really take credit for them because they came in dreams or other ways where it's like I was just forced to listen at a certain point because um, when I didn't, I mean, I was in Sydney and suddenly there was a magpie. We don't have magpies in Michigan, so it was weird that it even showed up, with me. But I was in Sydney, Australia, and there's this weird sound coming, and I'm like, oh God, sure enough, it's a magpie. So there were just that kind of really, it was at first a relationship with it that I kind of resisted for various reasons. And then it was like, okay, I just need to be paying attention. So that it was more tuning in and like receiving it than it was even like embodying it, because I probably resisted any sort of embodiment with it for longer than I should have. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that yeah, the magpie sort of found you, Emily, and it stalked you. Um I think it was a similar beginning for me with the crows. Like I was living in Olympia, Washington when I started writing some of these poems, and my partner at the time was getting dive bombed by crows. And like it happened multiple times. And I just became really fixated on like what, and I started looking it up and knowing that this was a thing that happens sometimes where crows would remember people and sort of single them out and follow them. And it was sort of mysterious about why they chose these people. And so I just became really fascinated with like the habits of crows, and sort of their experience of the world, and like their sense perception. I don't know if I've definitely never thought of any of these poems as persona poems, and I don't think I've ever like set out to write a persona poem necessarily. Um, but I definitely became interested in sort of like thinking thinking through their experience of the world and sort of their place at both like the edges and the center of like wherever um, human settlement is. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, they found me too, sort of stalked me. That's interesting. The magpie and the crow coming after us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I wrote something about your poems too, and the idea of like something about the environment and the humans bound to their environment, how they're kind of leaking into one another, or how in many ways the animals were um, kind of not overpowering, but bringing kind of this state of like accretion of like fragment or you know, this insightful observation or something upon, you know, the encroachment or something of the human environment. There's a question from Jace. Jace says, I'm interested in animals in both of your work too. If I can follow up on Jordan's question. Emily, you mentioned the magpies and the crows, and there are also termites in Ian's work. How does your poetry access or not the qualities of animals that we sometimes consider inaccessible? Emotional, psychological, consciousness, language, those types of things. It's a great question.
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
You got anything?
Oh, I'm curious. I'm curious to hear you answer this, Ian, because in part because your work did seem to play with sound so much and sort of yeah, I feel like how language and the texture and tone of a word accesses some of that, you know, versus even like sometimes I think in my work with Magpie, I sometimes worry too much or began to worry, like, you can work with an animal or a persona for so many qualities. And I've sort of struggled sometimes with the tension of like, I don't want to just be using this for the material itself. Like, what are the other aspects? And I feel like that's one of the strengths coming through in your work is um, there's other qualities, not just like the nature of a crow, for instance, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think like when I started writing about crows, I was like, um, wanted to think past just crow as like symbol because like they've been used a lot like to I mean to great effect, and like there's still so many things you can do with like the symbol of a crow in literature, but I wanted to be like try to push back, I mean like push past just like the silhouette of a crow and sort of think about its like life and habits, and I think one way that I sort of tried to start playing with that instead of being scientific about it, or like actually talking about what people who study crows have figured out, I tried to just sort of like play with language in a way that felt sort of like similarly strangely adaptable and playful in the way that crows are, and how it's situated on the page to sort of center lines and the language sort of tumbles in this way, and there's a little bit of like play with like typographical play too, that didn't really come across. I skipped a couple because I still don't really know how to read them. There's like a lot of apostrophes and things like that. But yeah, sort of like trying to like bring that across onto the page and like access it in that way. Because I think it's a really fascinating question that Jace asked, and I think it's still one that I wrestle with. Is like, how do you access you know animal other, and like think about their sense perception of the world, in a way that can like open up our own experience of the world or poetry without trying to map it exactly onto our own experience of the world, something like that.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see your poems on the page. I was wondering about that. That was going to be one of my questions is like, what do these look like in physical space, you know, the space of a page. So that's very cool. I'm trying to imagine them in my head now. Yeah, I love that.
I'm thinking of I read most of this book by Adrian Tchaikovsky called Children of Time. Did you all read this book? It thinks about what would happen if spiders became sentient and the consciousness of spiders on this planet. It's kind of interesting. I think the writing is just okay, but the kind of the idea of how we're locked away from the consciousness of other creatures. And I know that's one thing AI is trying to do right now is to translate into human language what whales are saying.
Hmm.
And will we have this capacity to actually at least encounter the different types of consciousness and language systems that exist? It's fascinating to see what.
That's interesting too, because weren't people having a bunch of dreams about insects at the beginning of the pandemic? Isn't that one of like the
Yeah.
collective things they were saying? So that like the spider thing kind of makes me like, maybe we are, you know, more part of that collective consciousness than we realize, you know. And yeah, but just not in it's through dreams, it's through other methods, you know. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think too, like that makes me think about the ways that like I think projects like that I'm really mistrustful of. Like the idea of like translating what an animal is saying to each other into our language, and especially like using our grammar and syntax, you know, it's like that's so specific. Like we're not just translating into human, we're translating it to like North American you know, English. Um, and yeah, I think that just like that sort of opened up for me too. Like I think part of the thing I wanted to play with the crow thing and knowing that any way to engage with the crow for me would have to be like a breaking up of syntax in weird ways too, and sort of like interrupting each other. And yeah, I don't know. It's such an interesting question about like yeah the ways we can or can't understand the ways that animals communicate with each other, and how they experience the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So is it Jimin? Jimin has a question. I'm wondering about both of your thoughts on the relationship of the writer to the persona. How does the embodiment or acknowledgement of the third other come out on the page and a reading and the performance of language?
Yeah, I don't know if this is exactly what the question is about, but one in my practice with, especially with Petronilla and thinking about, I don't know, like the ethics of persona poetry. Because even if it's a mythical kind of persona or someone who is not necessarily recognized as potentially as a, you know, real person having, they're in the gospels or they're in some mythical text in some way, there's still to me some like, uh, there's a power dynamic whenever you're doing that work, you know. And in the case of Petronilla, for me, it was like I could end up basically just using her as a talking piece, as a teaching tool, just like Peter did, by virtue of doing persona poetry with her and speaking through her. I mean, that's exactly, Peter wanted her to be in a certain spot for a certain reason and wasn't interested in her having agency in certain ways. And even as I attempt to story that, I can do the same thing. That's what was fascinating to me in the process, is like, we're always running into ourselves, you know, in that question. So that was something I thought a lot about as I was working with her. And honestly, haven't even read, I mean, this is the first reading where I've really read her poems like consecutively, and definitely noticed in the work as I was writing it, her poems are much more sparse than mine are. Her language, I could tell when it was her language coming through and not mine, which maybe sounds a little woo-woo, but if you're a fellow writer, you just know. It's like, yeah, that's not, this tone belongs to her and not to me, and I need to honor that. I need to not try to tighten it up or anything for myself, you know.
That's really beautiful. With Jameen's question, I kind of just want to hear Jameen speak on that. Jameen has a really beautiful book coming out called Asya, that has a lot of persona poem, and I feel like he's done so much more thinking about this than I have. I just want to throw it back at him. I don't really know the embodiment or acknowledgement of the third other come out on the page. I don't know. I feel like for me, it just I think that at least with this book for me, it's the sounds of it are like the driving force of it, and I think that's like how I try to embody it. Is like I feel it in my chest and sort of like hum along with it. I feel like it's a song that I'm just like that I try to keep improvising on, something like that.
Sorry, that was like a bizarre question. Thank you. I guess my question was like, sort of in terms of writing about a persona, you have the poet speaking, and then you have the speaker of the poem, and then the persona becomes the third other. So then you have, I think what Emily said about the responsibility of the writer, but then you're enacting the voice of the thing being personified, and the particular ethical kind of complications about assuming an animal or a person. So I guess I'm kind of curious about the third life that you do kind of create for the persona that's outside of the historical fact of the existence of the persona, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, that I feel like I want a whole conversation around this. I could, I could see your that's like yeah, like I want to hear more, Jameen, about what you're saying, and I'll look up your work after this because I just think these are really like generative questions, and they are the kind that like you can't have an answer for it decided before you begin the work. The work leads you into these questions and then shows you the way through. So at least for me with Petronilla, it was another aspect where there was an unconsciousness or semi-consciousness to it, of like some of it was still dream work. I mean, I had dreams where she was giving me things, and I didn't even know it was her for a long time until I ran into more of the symbolism. So um, I feel like there's like an invisible collaborator when you do deep persona. I mean, there's persona poems like, hey, I'm working with one poem, but I think at the point that you're like doing a book length project of what becomes persona poetry, it is, I've said before that I didn't feel like I was writing. I felt like I was just trying to listen at a certain point. So maybe the third factor or the third person is just you getting yourself out of the way. I don't know if that helps or not, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a
That's
great question. There's a ton of ethics behind it, right? And there's I mean, I always think about, the difference of taking on a persona of an actual person and then taking on the persona that you can feel, the state that I know I felt as a writer, that this is not me. This is something else, someone else, some, amalgamation of others. And that's a release. That's a relief and a release. But going into someone in particular who may not have the voice or who wasn't given the voice, like you said, that's a whole different set of ethical concerns, I think, for sure. Ian, you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
um I don't exactly remember. Yeah, I think I was just gonna appreciate Emily's answer. I really like that, like the getting out of the way, finding like the vehicle, and like you're saying, Jordan, like having this thing take form, and then just like communicating with it, and dreaming with it, however it manifests, whether that's through like character or sound, or image or whatever else. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it feels like at the point that you want it to do something, you've gone too far. Like at the point, like if you're trying to produce something or puppet something, it's no longer, for me, it's left the realm of that sort of ethical, open engagement with persona. And
yeah,
I just think as a writer, the more you live with it, the more you know when you're forcing it.
I think it can be said about almost all writing, yeah. When you're forcing it too much, when you're actually acting like a puppeteer, that then it becomes a problem in various ways. There's a
Mhm.
question here from Olga, for you specifically, Ian. The line, quote, "So it may survive as a threat to the structure," end quote. That seems like a mantra. Can you speak more to that in terms of your own work or structures you inhabit? Also, maybe structures that you look to um decrease the power of or the efficacy of or something like that as well, because I saw that the termite thing, directly going at the landlord and thinking like, how do we preserve these creatures so they can do what so they can have the effect that I can't have on this power system.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Thank you, Olga. That's a great question. Yeah, I definitely think it is a mantra, of like some sort of political ethic at the core of that work. And I think something I was thinking about a lot while writing that. The defensible space part of the title um is like a forest fire fighting term that you see a lot in the Pacific Northwest. People clearing space around their houses, so that the brush doesn't have like fuel to take on the private property. Um, and I just started thinking about like that word or that phrase a lot, like defensible space, and like what I started thinking about it like as what is defensible, and it's clearly what we think is defensible is private property. and you know, I think it's fairly well known that like these mega fire complexes that happen out there is because we are encroaching on all these spaces that need these fires to happen, and we do suppression tactics, and that just makes them worse. And yeah, we're just like building our way into it with settlements. And I think like comparing that with, you know, the termites who are doing sort of the same thing. They're just like making their settlement within this structure that is like impeding on, or you know, appearing in this place where they have always existed. And like thinking about naming too, you know, naming that termite invasion as a nuisance, as something that needs to be exterminated or eradicated. Whereas like, what if we called it just like the termites home? You know, like that just like reframes it in this way. And obviously, if you're trying to like take care of the house that you live in, you want to get the termites gone. But yeah, I think it's trying to push against conceptions of private property, settler colonialism in the West, and all of those things. And I think that thinking through and like with the animals that I sort of call in that was a way for me to sort of like uh, try to radically shift the framework of what of how we engage with these things, right? And crows for me became like this interesting model of like constant adaptation. Everywhere they go, they can live like pretty much everywhere, and they adapt and they find their way with waste and other things like that. They worship trash and they live by it, and I think that's really beautiful and important. And I think that bringing some of that broken syntax and things like that I was talking about earlier. Is I think something that's like an important ethic to me too with poetry. Not that all my favorite poetry has broken syntax, but I think that that's like an important sort of like fuck up that happens that can sort of press on people's idea of what's possible in poetry and what should be done and what should be done in language. Um, yeah, so I think that was like important for me in this particular book as well. I think I was thinking back a little bit too, and I think this kind of relates to the idea of like the persona and the other. And I think if anything, I think like the other or the third that sort of is created or that I like ride with in this book is not a crow, but like an if a crow. I think like that phrase to me was like really essential to the generation of the book. It just like came up for me one day, and I just was able to like use that as a beginning to a lot of things. So it's like I think that acknowledges that I'm not inhabiting the crow. I don't know the crow. I don't know that crow, but I know an if a crow, you know, like if I can imagine something, if a crow were to approach this thing, then what? And I think that has to do with like the sort of threat to the structure too, is like if we can live in the ifness of things, not coming down on very solid knowledge that we know what's best or the way to fix things, but living in questions and like staying with that. Yeah, the impossibilities of things.
Yeah, I really like that. I like the idea of this tension between adaptation and investment, because I think that's something I know as a writer, sometimes we can invest too heavily in that, and that has
Mm,
its own perversion as well. We can invest so heavily in something monetarily, and we become perversely attached to it.
right.
But the idea of possibility is the other tension point in that, to maybe kind of give us that perspective where we're not perverting this sense of ownership or control. It's a really nice way of looking at it. Um, so I want to thank you all for spending time and finding the alternate route to this reading. Um, and Ian, I look forward to seeing you in hopefully a couple weeks here in New Orleans, in your town. And Emily, I hope to see you at some point, um, here, there, if you're ever in Kansas City.
Yeah.
But thank you everyone for coming through. I will go ahead and make a recording, and I'm going to go back in and I'll cut out the unwanted visitor who came in.
Thank you.
I've always heard about, those moments like, oh, it's happening now here with me, with us together. So, but anyway, thanks for rolling with that and continuing back in. And that was a beautiful reading and such a lovely way to spend an afternoon. Um, So thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. Again, I'll get the video edited and up in a few days, a couple days maybe, okay?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. And thanks, Ian. It was so wonderful to hear your work. I'm excited to see it on the page now. It's very cool.
Appreciate that. Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. It was wonderful finding those resonances too.
Yeah, super cool.
And thank you so much, Jordan, again. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks,
for
Jordan.
coming.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.